Welcome everybody to the next iteration of the IIT seminar series. It is my great pleasure to introduce Axel Rossberg, who is none other than the mastermind behind IIT itself, who is going to give a talk about the evolution of prudent predation today. And without further ado, Axel, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Yuri, and I'm very happy that you all came today to join this talk, and I'm even more happy that the whole series is running so well. So it's a great honor to also now contribute a few thoughts on my own. This talk is about this thing called prudent predation. So I just want to briefly explain what I mean by that. And I do this using a model simulation of a Rosenzweig-MacArthur predator-prey model. And here I have run it with the attack rate set to 1. And with this attack rate and these parameters, the predator dies out. And now I multiply attack rate by 3. I take a 3 times higher attack rate, and then predator and prey can coexist. And now I multiply attack rate again by 3. So it's a 9-fold increase total. You see these large oscillations of predator and prey population. If you take the logarithmic axis for the population sizes, you see the prey declines by huge amounts, and typically would expect that this leads to extinction of the prey, and then because there's no more prey, also extinction of the predator. So you see there is a very narrow range in attack rate where actually predator and prey can coexist. And this is a general phenomenon. The window of permissible attack rates is very narrow. And the attack rates where you get coexistence of predator and prey, that's why I call prudent predation. There's nothing to do with the thinking or the feeling of the predator. It's simply the value of attack rates. And we want to know, why are predators prudent? Because we see predator and prey coexist in nature. Are they prudent? Oh, yes. What is going on here? Why are these parameters so fine-tuned that we get, in some sense, predator-prey coexistence? And this notion of prudent predation goes back to Lawrence Slobodkin. Here in this paper from 1960, he said it the first time. He mentions here prudence, and he quickly developed the idea that consumers, predators, or consumers in general, have evolved to be prudent. First, he was relating this something to ecological efficiency. He says evolution has led to very high ecological efficiency, but later he relaxed this notion a little bit and said only prudence has led to predator-prey coexistence. And yes, he wrote this book about it, and then a few years later he got beaten up terribly, particularly in this paper here by Maynard Smith and Slatkin, where they said, well, Slobodkin hasn't really thought about how this should work, and doesn't he actually assume there is group selection? And group selection is, at this time at least, was a very bad word to say, because Maynard Smith had published a paper in Nature where he explained, like, oh, group selection is, cannot happen. Kin selection, yes, group selection not. And because of this, and this had a lasting impact, you read now even in this encyclopedia of ecology since 2008, and I think even now, that there is no evolutionary mechanism that can lead to prudent predation. So something else is happening. But in general, people understood and still understand that there is some problem to be solved. There is no question. This goes back to the gentleman here, Herodotus, an old Greek, and he already said there must be some reason why this prey is not diminished from Earth and being eaten up. And if you read Charles Darwin carefully, he runs into this problem at one point, and then comes up with a solution which doesn't really work, and then kind of moves on quickly. And of course, he's forgiven for that. And then later, people pick this problem up again. In particular, Alexander Nicholson. He said, oh, in my model, I get these oscillations, population oscillations that reduce populations to very low levels. And you're all aware of the experiments of Gauss, where he does exactly what I showed you in the R simulations, that in one way, either the predator first extinguishes the prey and then goes extinct, or the predator goes extinct and the prey just explodes. And he used some tricks to get the coexistence of predator and prey in his models. And Nicholson also, he suggested a solution to this problem. He said, oh, maybe there are different meta-populations. There are the different kind of patches that are occupied by predator and prey, and when the predator prey locally go extinct, this patch is recolonized by predators and prey from other places, and so the whole thing can stabilize. This is essentially what he had in mind, and this has been later built in experiment here by Pimentel, I'm sorry, and previously already by Huffaker, and yes, and then later in simulations. Alan Hastings, Ray Hilborn, they have all simulated these systems and found, yes, if you have a little bit of meta community dynamics, you can stabilize predator-prey coexistence, but they also found that you have to be careful choosing your parameters. You still don't fully overcome this constraint of parameters, and you have a bit wider range, but not an arbitrarily wide range. And this is one of the reasons why this can't be the full solution. The other reason is if you look carefully, for example, in this experiment here, you found that actually the predators evolve. They evolve and become less aggressive, and their reproductive capacity therefore declines. And something similar, Michael Gilpin found in simulations of these models where he let the attack rate evolve. And same is found by these guys here, Mitteldorf and colleagues, and where it was they used an individual-based model. And then Rand and colleagues even took it further. They took a what is it called, a cellular automaton model, where kind of there is no sharp, clear spatial structure anymore, no meta community structure anymore. And this model by Rand was then analyzed further in order to understand what's really going on by Goodnight and colleagues. And they found the following. They found, yes, our attack rate, which they call tau here, reaches some evolutionary stable value. Here you can see this cellular automaton cranking on. The green is the prey. The colorful reddish stuff is the predator. And you see that eventually you get a stabilization around 0.3. And they found out a way to calculate a time-dependent fitness, as that fitness is a function of attack rate in time. And if you look at very, very long times, then you see that indeed the fitness is maximum at the observed attack rate. But if you look at shorter times, it doesn't. And so they said you have to really look at long-term fitness. We all know that fitness is defined as the population growth rate in long terms. But they said they really mean it. Very long terms you have to look, and then you get the right interpretation of what's going on, and you understand that everything is consistent with Darwinian evolution. Furthermore, Lyon and friends, in this paper here, they came to the conclusion that actually group selection and kin selection are not so different things. The difference is in the way you do your math, in the way you do your calculations. But yes, so this idea that group selection is totally impossible by kin selection, it doesn't really hold water. And here Vincent Janssen showed this quite explicitly. He worked through a model and calculated fitness using the kin selection method and then using the group selection method, and of course it's the same. So yeah, so it's great, right? We have now evolution of prudent predation models. Group selection is no problem anymore. So we should all relax and say, yeah, of course, prudence evolves. But there is a problem. There is a problem, and this is that in these models and also in these experiments, you have these very strong fluctuations, local fluctuations of populations. And this red area here is the time range represented here in this movie of the experiment. And here, similarly, you see these in the simulations by Goodnight and colleagues. It's very, very strong increase and decreases in the population density. You have these places where everything is dead. And that's not quite what we see in nature. In nature, everything is a bit more relaxed, a bit more kind of stable. And so something is missing here. Something is not right. And probably that's the reason why people still are skeptical about prudent predation. And so now here comes our contribution to this whole discussion. We set up a different model for the evolution of prudence. It's also a meta community model with patches connected by dispersal. But in each patch now we have an entire food web, two-level food web with producers and consumers, and they are all linked with each other. And here's the model definition in a nutshell. The important thing is each consumer has an associated base attack rate. And the base attack rate evolves according to this rule, where this is the ancestral base attack rate, this is the new base attack rate, this zeta is a normally distributed random number, and gamma 0 and gamma 1 are constant. If you take the logarithms on both sides, you can see this corresponds to inheritance plus some random number plus an offset and mutation bias, which gives you the new attack rate. And what we do in practice, we don't model the entire meta community. We just model one patch, and then we say this one patch is statistically representative of all other patches. So instead of picking an ancestral species from one of the other patches, we simply pick one of the local community, but it shouldn't really matter. Okay, so we have now the base attack rates of all the consumers, and to calculate now to sample the interaction strengths of consumers with resources, we use this formula here. This is the base attack rate. Then we multiply it with a log normally distributed random number, where the size are here, again, normally distributed numbers. And alpha 0 is just a conversion factor to make these interaction strengths dimensionless, because we want to simulate and think in terms of dimensionless interactions. And the dynamics of the model is then given by a very standard Lotka-Volterra model. The resources don't compete with each other. They have just a carrying capacity, which is 1. And here the resources are eaten. Here the consumers eat the resources. And then this here respiration rate is also 1 in this system. And we build these communities one by one by adding species one by one. We add a species, we simulate the model. Whenever a species falls below some small number b min, we remove it. And then we add another species and simulate again, and until we reach a steady state. And doing this, what we get is this. Species richness first increases as we add more and more species, and then it starts to settle in and reach some steady state. Similarly here, the base attack rate, average base attack rate reaches a steady state. And you see some fluctuations here, but these are fluctuations now on a very long time scale. Between two invasions, the model is very harmless. It reaches an equilibrium and then stops to move, and you add a new species and it reaches an equilibrium again. Okay, so we want to understand why does now base attack rate reach a steady state here. And in order to do this, we again calculate the long-term fitness. In our case, the long-term fitness is this thing, the logarithm or this themselves, the R of base attack rate. R is here the average number of new patches that the population at the given patch colonizes. So how many different new colonies do you generate? That's our long-term fitness. And you can decompose this into the rate of creating new colonies and the lifetime of a population at the given colony, at a given patch. Yes, and if you take these logarithms, then indeed this curve here should be the sum of the other curves, and it is. That we try to check with a red line. Then because of the mutation bias, the fitness maximum is not actually maximum. You have to turn your head to the side a little bit, but if you work it out, it all comes out nicely. That's what we expect. We also expect, as we see here, that the colonization rate increases with base attack rate. The more aggressive you are, the easier you can colonize other patches. But the unexpected is this, that the lifetime within a colony decreases with base attack rate. The more aggressive you are, the shorter you live in a community. And you may expect, why not? They are more aggressive. They should be better competitors. So that's what we want to understand here. Why is lifetime decreasing with base attack rate? And we found in our model that in most cases, extirpations happen because of competition between consumers. And in fact, often in most cases, it's just competition with one other consumer. So we just ignore all the other consumers and look at competition between two consumers. And then the criterion for competitive exclusion of this consumer K by some other consumer L is this thing. And you may have seen something similar before. By rearranging the terms a bit, you can write exactly the same thing like this with the logarithms. Oops. And this term A is the linear growth rate of the competitor. The term B is the intraspecific competition of the competitor. C is the linear growth rate of the focal species, and D is the competitive overlap between focal species and competitor. So, and in order for the focal species K to survive, this must not be smaller than 0. And so we look at the distribution of this expression in the steady state of the model, and you see, yes, of course, it's not smaller than 0. And also we see that with increasing, where is it here, with increasing base attack rate A, this from small to large, this expression becomes smaller on average. That means extirpation of L of K due to competition becomes more likely. That's what we saw. They live shorter if they are more aggressive. And why this? Well, now we can decompose this expression. We can look at the logarithm or minus logarithm of D. This is this one here. And we see this behaves as we expect. With increasing base attack rate, the competitive overlap becomes larger. That means minus log D becomes smaller. The thing that doesn't behave as we naively expect is C. You would expect also C, and so log C, to increase with increasing base attack rate, but in fact, it declines a bit. That's surprising. And that's the reason why in the end you see here the decline of the competitive ability of consumers with increasing base attack rate. So why this? We looked at it and said, oh yeah, in fact, initially, at the moment where the consumers invade, the more aggressive ones have the higher linear growth rate, but then they extirpate some of their resources. And in fact, yes, and so the aggressive species lose their benefit. And then it's, as the resource community turns over, this doesn't become better. Yes. And so we see from this analysis, aggressive consumers have small linear growth rates C, and which makes them vulnerable to competitive exclusion. And we only want to understand now this bit here. Why is this declining? And this is so simple. This is the impact of the consumer as it invades the community. So simple, we can do it analytically. And now there is kind of 2 pages of analytic calculation, and this is the result. It turns out, because aggressive consumers extirpate their main resources, their linear growth rate after impact is independent of their base attack rate. So whatever the base attack rate, if it's large enough, it's always the same. Yes, and the specific condition that we have here is that we go to the limit of large base attack rates and large resource richness, and we fix this sigma here. This is a spread of the link strength distribution, so that we always get the same dietary diversity. And then we evaluate the formula for so-called apparent competition, which I prefer to call consumer-mediated competition, and see how many of the main resources of the consumer are extirpated as a result of this consumer-mediated competition. And we find that on average, when this stops, when the consumer-mediated competition stops, then C has this value 1 minus the dietary diversity of the invading consumer. C equals 1 minus nu. And you can, the C, remember, is this expression here. It's the linear growth rate of the invading consumer. And you can also write it as RK minus 1, where RK is the analog of the basic reproduction number, which often people call R0 in our model for species K, basic reproduction number, but on short time scale. This is a short-term fitness in the sense, and we looked before at the long-term fitness. Okay, and you can verify that numerically that works pretty well. So the average of C declines with the impact of the consumer and the extirpation of the main resource, and then kind of not much happens as resources turn over. Okay, so we have everything together now. You look at the mathematical calculations and you understand this expression. You have to look at the paper that indeed the linear growth rate is independent of base attack rate if base attack rate is high enough. That means that the more aggressive consumers in the end are weaker competitors than the less aggressive ones. That means that the strong and more aggressive competitors live shorter in the community because eventually something will happen and they are kicked out and they have a higher risk of being kicked out. And because of this, you get this nice stabilization of base attack rate in our model. So great, you understood this. And now the next question is it real? Is this what I just told you? Is this now something that happens only in this model? Or maybe that's how it works in reality. I want to show you three smoking guns. The first smoking gun relates to stock recruitment relationships in fisheries. So the fisheries manager, they ask, how many recruits, how many young fish do you get for a given biomass of the stock? The larger stock gives you more recruits. And this little square here is the unfished stock, where there's in equilibrium. And so they measure these stock recruitment relationships, they fit a line. And then what they often do is they characterize the line by a parameter called steepness. And steepness of 0.2 corresponds to a straight line. 1 corresponds to this box, and the higher steepness, the steeper the line is here near 0. And what they find is typically that steepness is near 0.8, which means you have a curve like this, as you see here. And here you see a distribution of steepness values for many different demersal species. And indeed, steepness reaches a value near 0.8. And that's interesting because the steepness actually is something very similar to basic reproduction number. Yes, basic reproduction number times 0.2. And so H equals 0.2 corresponds to basic reproduction number 1 all along this line here. And yes, and so our prediction is that basic reproduction number attains some value independence of attack rate. And so the prediction would also be that steepness attains some value independent of attack rate. And so we would expect some preferred value of steepness. And indeed, that's what is seen in these by the fisheries managers. And they depend very much on this. So lots of fisheries management builds on the assumption or observation that steepness has some preferred value around here. Smoking gun number 2. Our prediction is that the predators invade, the consumers invade the community, and then shortly after they invaded, they extinguish their main resources. They make a mess out of the resource community. And when they extinguish their main resource, they still eat some not so important resource. They can still survive, but as weakened competitors. And so they survive and survive until something strange happens. Something is not quite right. The weather is not right. Some new species invades. Something happens. Because they are weakened competitors, they go extinct. And as you see here, for example, yes, you see with a lot with invasive alien species, in particular if these are consumers, they invade, stay for a while, and then suddenly they disappear from the local community. You see it here for the signal crayfish in Swedish lakes, which doesn't belong there. You see it here for the comb jellyfish in the Black Sea. In the last century, there was a big story, this jellyfish in the Black Sea. Now it's gone. Nobody talks about it anymore. And you also see it with the lionfish in the Gulf of Mexico. It's the lionfish is still spreading in the Gulf of Mexico. It's still a problem. But if you look locally at reefs, you see that it grows in abundance, and then eventually it starts to decline here and here and here. And here, actually, it declined a lot. And we believe that's our mechanism at work, that these invasive alien consumers, which are too aggressive and make a lot of destruction in the local community, cannot stay forever. Eventually, they will collapse, and there is a separation between the ultimate cause of their collapse, which is at the time of invasion, when they destroy the resource community, when they extirpate their own resources, and the proximate cause of extinction, which is much later, when something else happens, and often people don't know what exactly happened, which then leads to their demise. And then there is a third smoking gun. And this is if you simply look at the attack rates of species, for example, in pelagic ecosystems. At the pelagic ecosystem ecologists, they call attack rates clearance rates. And here, Kirby and Hurst, they did a huge meta-analysis of clearance rates and of respiration rates. And they found that they scale very similarly, both within functional groups and across functional groups. And you expect this similar scaling of clearance rate and respiration rate if the density of food available to consumers is independent of their body mass. So if large predators have the same density of food available as small predators. Indeed, that's what you see in the ocean. The size spectra of oceans are roughly, the biomass is roughly evenly distributed over the logarithmic body size axis. And so this is also what you expect from prudent predation. You can also ask, so is the actual value of attack or clearance rate then so high as you would expect that the consumers can just invade and sustain their population, but not higher? And it turns out it's not quite. The attack rates that people see are a bit too low. If you just multiply attack rates with prey density and divide by respiration rate, you will see they should die out. And the pelagic ecologists, they know this, and they have made up their mind. They say, oh, maybe the resources are distributed a bit patchy in the ocean. So there are areas of a bit higher density, and therefore, even though the density is slightly too low, or the attack rates are slightly too low for the consumers to survive, somehow they can just make it. And that's what we expect. We expect they can just about make it based on our theory. They shouldn't be too aggressive. And that's what you see actually in these data. Yeah. And so that's it. So the conclusion is prudent predation evolves because too aggressive consumers extirpate their main resources, which makes them weak competitors. And then they lose out in competition, and that's not good. And so they evolve to become more prudent. And the interesting thing, which gives us some confidence that what we're doing here is related to reality, is that this explains the preferred values of steepness, the sudden collapse of invasive species, and this allometric scaling of the attack rates of pelagic consumers. And that's it already for my talk. So I'm happy we have lots of time for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Axel. So if you have a question, please raise your hand in the chat and I will be calling on you. Yes, Abdel, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for that talk. I guess I just had a sort of conceptual question, or I'm not sure if it's conceptual, but do
Yeah,
you
fire-
perceive
fire-
this? Do you perceive this to be a sort of frequency-dependent selection on some level that's going on, where some competitors are stronger and some competitors are weaker, and then they balance each other out? Because the predators, which are, I guess, have higher predation attack rate, are better predators and they have more fitness, but if they're weaker competitors against other predators, then it seems like there's a sort of frequency-dependent selection component that's going on in this model.
I think that's not what's going on. So if I understand this frequency selection dependent selection idea right, they are better and worse at the same time. You see, at the moment where they invade, the more aggressive consumers are the better. They just can invade more communities. They have higher linear growth rates.
Right.
And then only after they extinguish their prey, in the long term, they're worse competitors. So the magic is all in the extirpation of the prey.
Right. Okay, so I guess you're not seeing in your model a coexistence between high and low attack rates. You're seeing like more a single attack rate.
Yeah, there's a
Like
distribution. There's a range of attack rates here, and there are some which have higher attack rates and some that are lower attack rates. But yes, the one with the higher attack rates eventually cannot spread so easily.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Giza, please go ahead.
Axel, this is very exciting, and of course I don't understand all of your calculations, but if I'm interested in the simplest possible situation, the simplest possible situation if there is a single food and two consumer compete for them, and then the higher attack rate push down the resource, but it pushed down the resource for the another its competitor. So in this case, at least intuitively, it doesn't seem to work.
Exactly, perfectly right. It doesn't work. Yeah.
Yeah. Then okay. If I still I understand your argument when there is a community and then there is an invader and it is not so successful on the long term. I understand this.
Mm-hmm.
But then this is a good point. But then I'm not sure whether it is a real solution, whether why the attack rates are not too high. Because if I have a species which has a mutation for higher attack rate, but otherwise it's the same distribution of resources, then it's just a higher attack rate and will not acquire.
Yes, but
Yeah.
I think the one element of your way of looking at it, and that is the very, very popular way of looking at it, is to think to disregard that actually in reality communities do turn over all the time. It's not so that the predator and the prey stay together in the same community for over evolutionary times. This whole thing turns over, and one lineage of a predator which was maybe more aggressive or had a higher attack rate, and where this mechanism worked in the first community, may encounter different prey or different prey sets in the other community, and then suddenly the one that was a bit better suddenly is a bit worse, and so then all this mechanism already doesn't work anymore. So once you consider that you have permanent turnover, and you get this not in the simple two species models, but in meta community models, you see automatically you get this turnover, and then the game is completely different.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Jürg, please go ahead.
Yes, so from my understanding, this kind of entire motivation comes from the fact that if we see if we have very low attack rate, the predator dies out, and if we have very high attack rates, then we get these wild fluctuations, which we basically don't observe in nature. So there must be something going on, right?
Yes.
Did I understand correctly that everything, like your model is built on Holling type 1 response functions?
Yes, but it doesn't require type 1. So here is the actually first thing I came across this was 2008. We built a food web which is very complicated, has lots of different species. They are linked through type 2 functional responses with prey switching and very complicated food web among these different species here, different body size, different abundance. And we let attack rate evolve, and the same thing happens. And this model, by the way, agrees very nicely with observations. The reason I'm having type 2 functional response, type 1 responses here is only because the mass is so much easier.
Yes, okay. So what you're saying is that, because my understanding is that as soon as we have a Holling type 2 response functions, basically this paradox of enrichment disappears, right? We don't see, or, well, it doesn't.
It comes, yeah, with type 1, you don't have oscillations. With type 2, you get oscillations.
Oh, yeah. Was that
it? So the mechanism is slightly different. Okay, the mechanism is slightly different. So in the traditional way of modeling prudent predation, you need these oscillations, and so you need the type 2 responses.
Okay.
And in our case, we don't need the oscillations, and so we just take type 1 responses.
Yeah, I see.
Because the mechanics is a little bit different, but we could also, the same would work in our case with type 2 responses.
Okay, I see. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Yael, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. Two very different systems came to my mind. So in terms of the way the mechanisms are described, they would be slightly different, but it seems that these results may have some, more general, maybe more general and less sensitive to the particular system you're using. And I was wondering if that's correct. So one of them is host pathogen populations, where you have a balance between invasion and persistence. You would usually, in a limited community size, you'd have pathogens that can, if they're too transmissible, they would usually, grow very quickly and then have a very deep trough, and then, very likely to go extinct for stochastic reasons. And if they were less transmissible but had longer duration, then they'd have a deep trough, and then they'd be less likely to go extinct. So they actually evolved to the edge of extinction, so to say. They become as transmissible as they can until they start burning themselves out as a function of the critical community size, which is, it seems, I'm wondering if, this one system that seems to be maybe related to this idea, because they're overeating their resource.
For the evolution of virulence,
not virulence, no. Right,
no,
I'm not speaking about it. I'm speaking about, I have a paper I can send, but it's about the balance of invasion and persistence. It's not a virulence. It's not a virulence argument. It's an argument of to what extent, the R0s are the same R0s, but you can either be more transmissible, burn through the population faster, be more competitive, but you're also more likely to go extinct once you're reaching those troughs. And in that sense, you'd be as transmissible as the population allows you to be before you you go extinct.
So in this kind of model, they also say they have some kind of self-organized criticality here.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's similar to what you describe. But I
Okay.
don't. So in our case, the communities are not in any sense close to collapse, and the meta communities are not close to collapse. They're just doing just fine.
Well, but they do. I mean, as you said, if you have predators that are more aggressive, they would actually lead to their extinction, right? They would be overeating their resource.
Yes, but you can be a little bit more aggressive and still make it. Just on the long term,
I see.
Your chance of spreading are not so great, and therefore eventually you die out. So this lionfish here, this lionfish, where is it? The bloody lionfish here. This is too aggressive and spreading. But our assumption is that because of this phenomenon that they always stay at each reef only for a short time, eventually they will evolve to become less aggressive. But they can make it.
So it's not actually criticality that's limiting.
No.
Another very different system is there was this question always of how do open populations regulate themselves in the ocean, for example. The classic paper by Refgarden on the barnacles, where larvae would come in and the larvae would settle, and later there were extensions also to coral reefs. And if the corals would grow too fast, then they'd actually be, again, taking their resources too quickly, and then the new larvae coming in wouldn't have enough space to settle, and you'd start getting these oscillations. So the systems would actually lose stability because of high usage of free space. And there, I don't think it's a criticality issue.
No.
Okay, anyhow, I just thought of raising these two systems that seem to have some similarities.
Yes, but in this case, you see, you get these oscillations, and this is another route to prudence or some related phenomena, and the point here is here's a different one where you don't need the oscillations. The other one works as well, and maybe it's sometimes active. I don't deny that sometimes it's active, but I wouldn't
okay, so I understand now. So that's what I missed. The dependency on the on the instability of the oscillations. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Jeremy, please go ahead.
Thanks, Axel. Just let me hear me a little better. So I wanted to return to the motivation you began with at the very beginning of the talk, the suggestion that attack rates need to fall within a fairly narrow range to avoid producing population dynamics that we rarely or never observe in nature. I guess my question is what makes that range narrow? How do we know what's a narrow range? What constitutes narrow? I mean, in your example, I assume you just chose sort of illustrative parameter values for whatever reason.
Okay.
I mean, you showed like a threefold range of attack rates, and I don't know, when I just think of like other variables, a threefold range could be big.
Let me answer your question. So you can calculate for a predator in this type 2 functional response the proportion of time it spends handling rather than foraging. Okay, proportion of time handling. Let's call this tau. Then the range, the width of the range is 1 + 1 over tau. And so if the handling time is 0, if they don't handle at all, then you have a Lotka-Volterra model, and then the range is infinitely large. But as soon as you have a little bit of handling time, it pretty quickly becomes narrow.
Okay.
1 + 1 over the proportion of time handling.
Okay. I'll need to okay, that's fair enough. I'll need to think about that.
And then for the case, so this is for the case where you get the oscillations, and then there is this other case where you start to induce consumer-mediated competition, apparent competition. The range is different, but it's also very narrow. It's also very narrow. And yes, I think everybody who ever played with these models has realized that at some point that you have to be careful not to get it wrong. You have?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you. Bob, please go ahead.
Yes, hey. Hey, Axel, that was a really interesting talk. I look forward to reading the paper. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my internet connection is, I'm in Eastern Tennessee in the mountains, and it's a little dicey at times. Yeah, I have several just sort of thoughts. One is, actually goes back to what Giza said a little bit, which is if you look around the world, there are a lot of low diversity communities where there's very little evidence for turnover. The high Arctic, for instance, oceanic islands, where paleoecological studies recently have shown that the Central Pacific, many of those communities have been around were around for a very long time before Homo sapiens showed up and eliminated species. And so there's not a turnover going on, and yet consumers are coexisting with their biotic resources. So there must be some other explanations for what looks like prudence or persistence of those interactions. And one thing that comes to mind is that in every strong predator-prey interaction that I'm aware of, there's a basic assumption your model made, which was a kind of a homogeneity assumption that each prey individual experiences the same probability of attack. And yet, if you have what's called absolute refuges, so you have patches where predators can't get for some reason, they can provide sources that feed the rest of the meta community, and that can stabilize almost any predator-prey interaction. I mean, this came out in the host parasitoid literature. You added absolute refuge to the Nicholson Bailey model, and it stabilizes. And that's particularly true if the refuges tend to be low in quality, so they don't tend to explode on their own, but they can persist, and that can stabilize the overall interaction. So
but you would expect these oscillations then, right?
Not necessarily.
That evolution pushes you to the strong oscillations.
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily, because what you get with stronger and stronger attack rates, if you have a source sink scenario, and the source is prey that are protected in a refuge, an absolute refuge from predators, but some of them leak out, the predators can hammer as hard as they like the prey that are escaping, because from their point of view, it's like a chemostat model where you have an influx of resources from the outside. So I think that's actually a really important contributor to stability of strong predator-prey interactions.
But has somebody modeled this? Has somebody modeled this and shown that?
I modeled it with Mike Hassel, 30 years ago.
Excellent.
Host parasitoid interactions.
Okay.
And
I'm sorry, I missed that.
No, it's all right. The world's a big place. This is not to deny the interest of what you've done, because there are systems where you have in continental settings, or what Yael was talking about, host pathogen systems, where you have very high diversity, lots of opportunity for turnover and so forth. And this could be a very important contributor. I was just saying that there may be complementary explanations as well out there. The other thought I was really more of a question, but the specific model you showed was a 2-level system. And I'm just curious what happens with more complex food webs. I mean, maybe that was just the particular equation you showed us.
Yes. So that's again this thing here. This is the more complex food web. So the color corresponds to the trophic level, and actually the trophic level can be anything. It doesn't have to be an integer. So there are loops you have there, and omnivory, everything. And it turns out that the math that you developed for the apparent competition applies in complex food webs as well.
Right.
So it's a math becomes more complicated, but it goes through. That still that the with higher attack rates, eventually always you generate apparent competition, extinction of resources.
Yeah. Well, anyway, very interesting, Axel. Appreciate it. Thanks for responding to my questions.
Thank you so much. Nadav, please go ahead. Sorry, Nadav, you're muted.
Okay, sorry. Okay. So thanks. I'm just trying to explain myself some aspects of your results. So I mean, you have special structure in your model, right?
Yes.
What's happened if you don't have special structure? If you have just a single patch or well-mixed population, is that true that in that case the predator will reach evolutionary suicide? I mean, it will increase the attack rate until it will deplete the consumer and then go extinct by themselves?
I'm not sure. I don't know. So we could in principle just make the no, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. I haven't tried it.
Okay. So I mean, okay. So fine. I just was wondering if the idea the main aspect here is a special structure, or the main aspect is that you have food web. And okay, fine.
I think you need the turnover. I mean, there are people who have modeled. Yes, there are people who have modeled complex food webs without the turnover, where then all the evolution, where all the mutation steps in that determine the interaction strengths and the attack rates, everything, all these steps are very small, and then you have a situation without turnover, and they have problems. They have problems building their food webs. So maybe it doesn't work, but I'm not sure.
Okay, so that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Henry, please go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Axel. Nice to
Hello.
be here. So, Axel, I just have a quick question. You have a carrying capacity, and where does that come from? Why is it constant?
Oh, because the resources they need. The resources they need.
The resources need resources.
Yeah, they need water or sunshine or stuff like this, or eating other things. So they need resources, and therefore they have a carrying capacity.
And those are just assumed constant somehow.
Yes. Again, in the simple model, here the resources have carrying capacity is determined by their own resources, by complicated interactions. So in this model here, this is not built in anymore. That's just the mass becomes more complicated, but it works, still works.
So, I mean, one thing that interests me is seasonality, and it can have some surprising consequences. Have you ever tried something like that?
I wouldn't see why it would play a role. I wouldn't see the reason why it could generate something interesting.
Okay.
I think the relevant timescales, you have seen this. It's more several years in these kind of examples here. This is many years, and so seasonality is averaged over, I think.
I think not, but obviously this is not the time and place to discuss that.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you. Jeff, please go ahead.
Thanks. Hello, Axel.
Hey.
Yeah, super interesting. I just wanted to make sure I understood some of the aspects of the mechanisms. So I think from what I got, the turnover is important because that's what, at least in a Lotka-Volterra model, changes the apparent competition strength or matrix. So if you wonder what is the competition between consumers, you have to consider the set of resources, and it only depends on the composition. And as long as the composition is fixed, the competition is the same, but now you're saying the turnover changes the competition strength. And therefore, this idea that turnover is fundamental, it's only because it's a Lotka-Volterra, and maybe more generally, you could think that the invader is transforming the environment. Like it's no longer what it was originally when it's invading, and now it's different. So in particular, its competitive abilities have changed. And in regards to this question, I think I had a similar question as the one of Nadav, that if you're not reintroducing resources, it would seem like you would you would reach a point where there would be only one left, and then you would just increase attack rate until this resource is really, really low, arbitrarily low. It's never exactly extinct in this case, but
yes. So if you stop adding resources, if you kind of, maybe the consumers still turn over, they can become more aggressive. You stop adding resources, then the number of resources will decline, and because the competitors compete for less resources, the number of competitors also declines until you have only one competitor, one resource, and then the normal mathematics of the normal consumer resource model applies, and this tells us that you don't have evolution of prudence anymore.
Yeah. So what prevents it from happening in your case?
Well, because the resources also invade. So there's a turnover of resources as there is turnover of consumers. So we make sure that we have both in the model.
Thanks.
Does it? Did I miss something? I did not understand your question. Was there something?
No. I think
okay.
You answered my question. Yes.
Okay.
The first one was about the competition. Like, I was just want to make sure I understood that's what's going on. That the turnover is required to change the competitive strength between consumers.
Yes. So the belief is that somehow the community changes, or the climate changes, or something changes, and probably also the community turns over. Because of this, eventually a situation is reached where this non-prudent species declines. The point is from what happens in the beginning, in the impact phase, this is not enough to extinguish the non-prudent species. Something else has to happen. It's weak in the competition, but it can still survive. Okay. Time to. Thanks a lot for the discussion. I enjoyed it very much. And Bob, please send me your link to the paper. I have to read it.
Nadav is sending a message, by the way, saying the basic dynamics of the model supports a limit cycle. Seasonality introduces a new time scale that may interfere with the time scale associated with that limit cycle.
Yes.
I respond to the argument about the possible importance of seasonality. You may have some sort of parametric resonance where seasonality resonates with the intrinsic limit cycle.
That's conceivable. Yes, that's conceivable. That's true.
Are there any other questions? If not, then thank you again.
Paper will be out hopefully next Monday.
Thank you.
And then you get all this in small print.
Yeah. Okay, if there are no more questions, then thank you so much again, Axel. And thank you everyone for coming. And we are going to continue in 2 weeks. So see you all then.
2 weeks. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.